James who? You might ask in a puzzled tone. Now hold on a minute. I'm just as familiar with the assassination as the next person, but I never heard of anybody named James Tague. Who in the world is that? If Tague's name does sound strange and out of place in this grouping, there is a simple explanation. Until now, only a minuscule fraction of the American public has ever seen or heard James Tague mentioned in connection with the slaying of President Kennedy. Hello and welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess, Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. We are walking through the JFK assassination through literature. We have gone through probably about 20 books at this point. Today we are going to read a selection about a man named Jim Tague. This chapter is called The Forgotten Victim, Jim Tague and the Not So Magic Bullet. Those two names are, of course, linked, Jim Tague and the Magic Bullet, because Jim Tague, if you didn't know, is the reason why there was the magic bullet theory, or the single bullet theory, proposed by Arlen Specter during the Warren Commission. A little review would be that because they found 3 bullet shells under the sniper's nest in the book depository, they were limited to 3 bullets, and they needed to account for all of the wounds on both men, both Kennedy and Connolly, with those 3 bullets. Well, Jim Tague is the reason why they had to take all those wounds and bring them down to 2 bullets. Let's read. For tens of millions of us, those terrible events of November 1963 automatically call to mind a cast of principal characters whose names and the images they convey are by now almost as familiar as our own. JFK and Jackie, Lyndon Johnson, John Connolly, J.D. Tippit, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, J. Edgar Hoover, Earl Warren, James Tague. James who? You might ask in a puzzled tone. Now hold on a minute. I'm just as familiar with the assassination as the next person, but I never heard of anybody named James Tague. Who in the world is that? If Tague's name does sound strange and out of place in this grouping, there is a simple explanation. Until now, only a minuscule fraction of the American public has ever seen or heard James Tague mentioned in connection with the slaying of President Kennedy. And only a tiny handful of serious assassination students realize the tremendous impact his experience could have on the case. Indeed, Jim Tague himself would never be presumptuous enough to suggest that he belongs on that short, exclusive list above. He is neither famous nor notorious, yet in many ways he is every bit as important as any of the others. To the few who know of his role in Dealey Plaza, he projects the image of a stunned young man wiping his hand at a spot of blood on his face. Blood drawn by a tiny fragment of a bullet intended for JFK during the dizzying seconds after the motorcade has streaked away with the martyred president. In the wake of the assassination, federal authorities at first tried to pretend that Jim Tague did not exist. Then, when his existence became impossible to deny any longer, they harassed him and did their best to discredit him. For close to 30 years, they have sought to disregard the significance of what happened to him on November 22nd, 1963. But nothing they have been able to do can alter these 2 basic facts. 1, Jim Tague was and is the 3rd victim of the shots that killed President Kennedy and wounded Governor Connolly. And number 2, his experience at the moment of the shooting constitutes living proof that the Warren Commission's claim of a single assassin firing 3 bullets, and 3 bullets only, at the presidential motorcade is factually unsupportable. What it means is that, at the very best, the Commission's verdict is an ill-informed impossibility. At worst, it is a deliberately invented lie. And based on his treatment after the fact, Tague has a strong tendency to believe the latter. One thing I want to tell you that I haven't mentioned in a couple of episodes, so I just want to make it clear, All the books that we are reading in this series are all linked in the show notes below. So if you need to come back to the series at any future point and think, where did that come from? Which book was that? You don't even have to go through a video. You can always just scroll to the show notes and look, and there's a full listing of every book that we've read from. So with links, so you can follow those to Amazon and you can look at reviews and, search for whatever you need. But that is where you can always find the notes for which books we've read from. The bleeding scratch that made Jim Tague a striking, if obscure, footnote to history has long since vanished without a trace. The bullet mark left on the curb where he stood that day also faded away with the passage of time, and the curb itself is locked up somewhere in the National Archives. That, at least, is the official story. They came and they cut out the section of curb we're going to read about. But the invisible inner scars, the anger, resentment, puzzlement, and distrust of authority still linger in Tague's mind. Although it was by far the most noteworthy event of the day, President Kennedy's visit to Dallas was far removed from Tague's thoughts as he drove toward downtown that Friday from the Oak Lawn area of the city where he worked as a salesman for a local Dodge dealership. Here is a whole selection of quotes from him telling us about himself. I was young, 27, single, divorced for 3 years, and I had a lunch date with a pretty little redhead who worked downtown and who soon after became his wife. Recalls the white-haired, soft-spoken Tague, who now lives in the Dallas suburb of Plano. That was the only thing I was thinking about when I swung off Stemmons Freeway onto Commerce Street and promptly got stalled in a huge traffic jam. At first, I didn't have the slightest idea what was going on, so he's on his way to a lunch date. But it seemed obvious that nobody was going to be going anywhere for a while, so I got out of my car. I was right at the edge of the triple underpass, and I stepped onto the narrow section of curb between Commerce and Main Streets to see if I could tell what was going on. And we get a picture of where he was standing. So this is a look at the triple underpass. The presidential limousine would have passed under this one that you can't see. But there are two additional ones, and he is standing. Each one has a kind of a column or a wall supporting and separating it from the others. So this is the far one, and he is standing on that little bit of street between the two far streets of the triple underpass. That's where Jim Tague was standing, and you can see him standing there just minutes after the shooting. Just then I saw the president's car turn onto Houston Street off Main, and it dawned on me what the traffic tie-up was all about. It's funny the different ways that different people get to this spot. That's been one of the fun things just reading through this selection has been, and others, has been hearing about, Jean and Marianne just kind of finding that spot because nobody else was there and a police friend had told them that could be a good place to stand. Or, Zapruder coming and then deciding to go back to get his camera, and so he's just like wandering around looking for a spot. And just the way that various people ended up in this spot, well, he was on his way to a date. That's really funny and quaint and sweet that he had no idea, and all of a sudden he realizes. He says, it was maybe 10 seconds later, just after the car had turned onto Elm Street, that I heard the first shot. I mean, on the one hand, this is being in the right place at the right time. And on the other hand, this is being in the wrong place at the wrong time, like both for him. It was maybe 10 seconds later, just after the car had turned onto Elm Street, that I heard the first shot. For some reason, I remember glancing up just at that instant at the Hertz sign on top of the Texas School Book Depository building. Later, everybody said the assassination happened at 12:30, but I distinctly remember the sign. It said 12:29. Then I heard 2 more shots. That's interesting because that is a detail. He just happened to be in that spot, but he was in the vantage point to look up exactly at that building. And so this is an eyewitness account that seems credible. He was in that position where you could see the full sign that was there at the time and gave the time. Along with numerous other eyewitnesses, Tague describes the first shot as sounding more like a firecracker than gunfire. Almost everybody describes it that way. It had a different sound, he said, not like the others at all. I thought somebody was throwing firecrackers. And it was only after I heard the other shots that I realized somebody was actually shooting. So that makes it seem like, it makes me question, because that first shot would have been possibly the one that hit the street that the Newman lady saw, or possibly the throat shot. But either one, it makes me wonder if they were suppressed fire or if they were with a different sort of, quieter gun or rifle. Again, I'm no expert on these things, but it does make me wonder how that shot or shots differed from the later shots, perhaps some from behind and certainly the one from the fence that was the fatal headshot, because those were all described as firecrackers. So it's an interesting point to pause on that it sounded different to him. When I did realize that somebody was shooting, I ducked behind the underpass for cover, and I was just peeking out as the limousine went by. Then, in a state of shock and confusion, Tague saw a crowd of bystanders rushing toward him, shouting, pointing, and waving their arms. One guy was crying, he remembers, and repeating over and over, "His head exploded, his head exploded." I mean, you guys, can you imagine the trauma of that moment? It's all happened right there in front of you, and all of you are left with it, and they're gone. I mean, we know about what happened on the road, that, Clint Hill is pounding the back of the vehicle, and Jackie is just saying, "I love you, Jack, I love you, Jack," and they're speeding towards Parkland. We know that part of the story, but the being left with it, of people crying, calling out what they saw, running toward it. Among those who raced to Tague's side was a tall man in a business suit and narrow-brimmed hat, who identified himself as Deputy Sheriff E.R. Buddy Walthers. "What happened?" Walthers yelled. "I don't know," Tague replied dazedly. "I mean what happened to you," Walthers said, staring at Tague. "You've got blood on your face." As Walthers spoke, Tague felt a slight stinging sensation on his cheek. He raised his hand to touch it and saw a few drops of blood on his fingers. "I don't know," he said again. "I think a stray bullet must have hit right close to you," Walthers said. "Maybe you caught a fragment of it." He stooped down and started looking at the curb, carefully examining it inch by inch. "Hey, look here," he said after a moment. "I think I found it." Tague recalls turning, still dabbing at the scratch on his cheek, and seeing Walthers pointing with a ballpoint pen at a whitish mark on the otherwise dingy gray curb on the south side of Main Street, almost exactly at the point where it entered the triple underpass. Well, leave it to our trusty friend, Robert Groden. I realized I always reach for my JFK absolute proof, but as I was thinking, I thought, I bet his first photographic book, The Killing of a President, has this in it. And sure enough, we have two photos that are significant for us. So one is this top photo right here. You can see the scrape on his left cheek. It says the bullet that struck the curb. So we have a pin mark or pin pointing to the spot on the curb. It said the bullet that struck the curb splintered and fragments of metal and concrete hit James Tague on the cheek. It could have come from the Dow Tex building or the depository. So they're saying either one could have gone down to here. And then there they have that bullet mark on the concrete. It said it struck the south curb where he was standing. So you can see where that is. Later, the section of sidewalk was removed and tested, and no traces of bullet metal were still there. Here is that section of curb that was taken from that spot. So, of course, we can always rely on Robert Groden to provide us with photographic evidence. So that book, The Killing of a President, is another one that you would like. It is the first photographic book. The second one was In Search of Lee Harvey Oswald, which we've looked at some in this series. And then the third is JFK Absolute Proof. So those are his photographic works that have 2,200 photos in them. So You may wish to have all three because they come in handy for moments like this one. As I was reading, I couldn't remember, was it on the right cheek or the left cheek? Well, it was right here, and it was a pretty long spot, wasn't it? It was surprising. Okay, he says, Tague recalls turning, still dabbing at the scratch on his cheek, and seeing Walthers pointing with a ballpoint pen at a whitish mark on the otherwise dingy gray curb on the south side of Main Street, almost exactly at the point where it enters the triple underpass. As Tague reconstructs the scene today, I walked over there and took a look, and the mark was plainly visible. Some people got the idea later on that it was a gouge and that part of the concrete had been blown away, but it wasn't like that. It was only a bright scrape on a curb that had turned dark from years of dirt and grime. I watched Buddy try to draw a circle around the mark with a pen. It looked like a pretty expensive pen, and I remember telling him he was going to ruin it on that rough curb. About that time, a newspaper photographer came along and took a picture of the curb with Buddy using his pen to point out the mark. That's the photo that we just saw. It seems appropriate to pause here in the story of Jim Tague long enough to mention at least briefly the chain of mysterious events that swirled around Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walthers himself. The chain began with his encounter with Tague, just seconds after the fatal shot struck President Kennedy. It ended slightly more than 5 years later with Buddy Walthers' own violent death. The picture mentioned by Tague was not the only news photograph taken of Walthers that day in Dealey Plaza. A short time later, he was also photographed along with Dallas policeman J.W. Foster, looking down at a grassy area on the south side of Elm Street as an unidentified, I have this also, and it exists in Robert's books as well, but we have this photo right here on the cover of Forgive My Grief 3. So I will, this is one of the photos being described. It says, along with Dallas policeman J.W. Foster, looking down at a grassy area on the south side of Elm Street as an unidentified blonde man picked up what appeared to be a bullet from the grass. When the picture was published that same afternoon in the Dallas Times-Herald, the caption beneath it read, "Agent inspects spot where bullets hit." Another photo, this one clearly showing a bullet in the grass and with the bullet circled for emphasis, appeared the following day in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram above the caption, "Assassin's Bullet." Moments after these photos were made, however, both the agent and the bullet vanished without a trace. To this day, no one has ever determined who the blonde man was or what happened to the bullet. This book was published, I believe, in 93. So, perhaps y'all can let me know in the comments. Sometimes I read things. Yeah, this is a 93 publication. So, that was 20. No, it was not 20. That was 32 years ago. So perhaps the blonde man has been identified. If so, please let me know in the comments. Some 10 months later, the Warren Commission would rule that only 3 shots were fired at the motorcade and that all struck within the presidential car. Buddy Walthers knew better, of course, since he had seen incontrovertible evidence that at least 2 other bullets had been fired and that both had badly missed their target. But when he was questioned by the Warren Commission, neither of these errant bullets was ever mentioned. One of the things that many witnesses have said at this point is that when they went to testify before the Warren Commission, what they were told was, you are not to give information about anything that you were not asked. Lee Bowers talked about this. Others that I've listened to said that they were specifically instructed only to answer what was asked. And so the pressure and implication was given before they even testified that don't you go rogue. Don't you go sharing things that are extra. Just share only what you're asked. As one of the first law enforcement officers on the scene, Walthers was among the most highly visible individuals in the area during the chaotic interlude just after the shooting. After leaving Tague, he was also among the first officers to enter the Texas Schoolbook Depository building. But by Tague's estimate, they were together until approximately 12:40 p.m., which meant that some 10 minutes and possibly as much as 12 to 15 elapsed before officers began to secure the building. Anything could have happened in that period of time, Tague says. It's also important to note that Walthers was something more than just another cop. He was a veteran of the Sheriff's Department, Criminal Investigation Division. one of Sheriff Bill Decker's most trusted lieutenants, and probably the most experienced investigator present during those crucial early moments immediately following the assassination. I mean, he's only the most experienced guy, and yet we just don't even want to hear from him. We don't want to hear the things he observed apart from what we want to hear about. That's the posture of the Warren Commission. Please don't tell us anything extra. We're not interested. We want to hear about what we want to hear about, and shut your mouth about the rest. The chain of mystery does not end there. As incredible as it seems, Walthers was also present in the Texas theater when Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested there, something more than an hour after the assassination. Walthers told the Warren Commission that he was one of the officers involved in the struggle to wrestle Oswald's gun away. Walthers' fellow officer, Deputy Roger Craig, we're going to have an episode about him in a few episodes from now, but claimed to have seen Oswald driven away from Dealey Plaza by someone in a light-colored Nash Rambler station wagon minutes after the assassination. The official conclusion is that the accused assassin left the immediate area on an eastbound bus and later caught a westbound taxi to his rooming house in Oak Cliff. According to information developed by the late Jim Garrison while he was district attorney in New Orleans, Craig made a special trip to police headquarters to tell Dallas Homicide Captain Will Fritz about the station wagon while Fritz was interrogating Oswald. On hearing the reference to the Rambler, Oswald reportedly said, "That station wagon belongs to Mrs. Ruth Paine, the woman with whom Oswald's wife was living at the time. Don't try to tie her into this." A short time later, as Garrison pointed out in his book On the Trail of the Assassins, Walthers drove to the Paine residence in the Dallas suburb of Irving and confirmed that Mrs. Paine did indeed own a station wagon matching Craig's description. There is no record that Captain Fritz or any other members of the Dallas Homicide Unit ever followed up on this lead, Garrison wrote. In fact, Fritz later denied that Craig had been at police headquarters or had told him about the Nash Rambler. However, a news photograph that turned up 6 years after the assassination in the autobiography of Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry clearly shows Craig at police headquarters, corroborating Craig's story. Because of what he saw with his own eyes and heard with his own ears, and because of who he was, Buddy Walthers' potential importance to the investigation of JFK's death is impossible to overestimate. Yet he was totally ignored at first by the Warren Commission and almost certainly would never have testified at all except for a quirk of fate that brought Tague, and hence Walthers, to the Commission's attention. So what's being said there is that had Tague not existed and they didn't need to corroborate it with Sheriff Walthers, they probably would have just ignored Sheriff Walthers altogether, which was the MO of the Warren Commission, to just not ask somebody if they could get away with it, to not even introduce evidence that they didn't want to in the case. Well, when Walthers was questioned by Assistant Warren Commission Counsel Wesley J. Liebler, neither the agent nor the bullet in the grass was ever mentioned. Once he had told Lieber that he thought the bullet that hit the curb beside Tague came either from the schoolbook depository or the Dow Tex building across Houston Street from the depository, most of the rest of the interview concentrated on what had happened at the Texas theater, which makes sense. It makes sense that they would have multiple things to ask him about. As for Jim Tague, he never had any further contact with the deputy after the day of the assassination. And if Walthers believed the investigation was mishandled, no one remembers him expressing such feelings. Curiously, a year or so after the assassination, Walthers became involved in an investigation by Dallas police after a bomb exploded in the yard of the deputy's Oak Cliff home. See, this is why reading these books is so important, because this starts to fit a pattern. People have said things like, well, why didn't this person get threatened in the 90s or in the 2000s? Well, in the 90s and 2000s, these witnesses were not still being killed off. But in the first few years right after the assassination, many, many, many witnesses had very similar encounters where there's weird circumstances around their death and things like this happening. A bomb exploding in the yard of the deputy's Oak Cliff home. The only damage that resulted was a hole in the ground. No charges were ever filed in the case, and no connection was ever made between the bombing and Walthers' role in Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination. But a year or so after, that was about the time that Mark Lane was going around and talking to people. And do you think there were threats? Do you think there were warnings? I would imagine that there were, and I would imagine that something like this would be delivered as a warning even without words. Whatever Walthers may have been able to contribute towards solving the Kennedy case was lost forever. On January 10th, 1969. On that date, Walthers and his partner responded to a tip that an escaped convict was hiding out in a local hotel with a woman companion. According to newspaper accounts published the following day, when the two deputies confronted the suspect, he pulled a hidden pistol from beneath a pillow on the bed and opened fire. When the smoke cleared, Buddy Walthers was dead, and his partner was wounded in the foot. The fugitive felon, James Walter Cherry, was quickly apprehended and subsequently sentenced to life in prison for Walthers' slaying. Several years later, Cherry petitioned for a new trial, claiming, listen to this, that authorities had concealed a ballistics test that showed that the fatal shot had actually been fired by the other deputy, presumably by accident. The petition was denied. Wow. Okay, well, we're going to continue with Tague. Before leaving Tague, Walthers had turned him over to a uniformed motorcycle patrolman who in turn radioed police headquarters with a terse report. I've got a man here with a slight wound that may have been caused by a stray bullet fired at the motorcade. Please advise what to do with him. After a brief pause, the reply crackled back over the radio. Ask him to come down to homicide and tell them about it. It's just funny to me that there's not even like a, hey, go make sure that he's good. Go get him at least in to see a clinic or something. Somebody needs to take a look at that guy and treat him and make sure things are good before he comes in. They're just like, get him down here. So after making a quick detour by his girlfriend's place of employment to tell her what had happened and canceled their date, Tague drove to the Dallas police station and took the elevator to the Homicide and Robbery Bureau on the 3rd floor, where he was interviewed by Detective Gus Rose. We were sitting there talking about what happened, Tague recalled, when all of a sudden there was this big commotion out in the hallway, and I saw some officers leading this guy in with TV cameramen and reporters flocking all around them. I said, "Who's that guy?" And Rose said he was a suspect in the shooting of a policeman in Oak Cliff. It was Oswald, of course. This is so fascinating, you guys. I hope you're as riveted as I am. I'm loving this real-time account of someone that we've never really heard from. Like, I've heard about Jim Tague, but I haven't, apart from watching little clips of his interviews on YouTube, which are available if you're interested. I've never heard this whole account, so this is very fascinating. It was Oswald, of course, and that pretty well ended my interview with Rose. Yeah, I bet so. A guy with just a flesh wound isn't near as interesting as the main event. After that, Rose's attention and everybody else's was focused somewhere else. Finally, I decided I might as well get out of there. Everybody had forgotten about me anyway. As far as I know, nobody ever even took down my name. After leaving the police station, Tague found himself drawn back to Dealey Plaza, and as he drove slowly through the plaza on Elm Street, following the identical route taken by the motorcade, he was surprised to be stopped by a uniformed policeman who came up to Tague's car and leaned in the window on the driver's side. He must have mistaken me for somebody else, but he seemed to think he recognized me. "You know what?" he said in this real excited tone of voice. "We found a piece of Kennedy's skull right over there." And he pointed to a spot on the ground a few feet away. I didn't know what to say. I just sort of shuddered a little, and then I drove on. That was the last mention of the assassination that Tague ever heard from anyone associated with the Dallas Police Department. This piece of skull is a different piece of skull than the one that was found the following day. That one is a different one that they took photos of and they shipped off. This one is a piece that's just later that day being found, and they're excited by it, by that discovery. And where did that go? We don't know. Tague spent much of that Friday evening at his home in suburban Euless, jotting down everything he could recall about the events of the day in a spiral notebook, which he still keeps in a safe place today. Have you ever been through a historical event like that you've done that with? I have. In fact, right down here under our bed, I keep our notebook. My husband and I, we were in our first year of marriage when September 11th happened, and we actually lived in the DC area at that time, and I could tell that story another day if y'all are interested. But I worked for the state of Texas. He worked for the National Gallery of Art. And getting home that day was a beast. And we watched the smoke from the Pentagon fires go up, and it was just horrific. It was very cinematic and movie-like. It was quiet and sober and frightening. We got home that night, and I had seen coverage because we always kept C-SPAN running in our office to keep up with what was going on the Hill. But my husband had been working. He was like a coat clerk for the National Gallery of Art at the time and finishing up his college years. And so he hadn't seen anything. And so we got home, and that was the first he had seen of anything on the news, and he was horrified. Anyway, but we had a notebook at that time where we wrote back and forth to each other. And that night we each sat and wrote down everything we could remember about the day, because we knew, like, this is a historic day that we will want to know our fresh perspective on years later. So I should actually pull that out sometime and reread those memories, maybe show them to our children. But it's a great exercise to do if you're ever in or near a historic event, where just to get down your memories while they are fresh, before history changes what you knew. So I'm really glad he did that. I wish we had an account of that. Maybe we'll get a little bit. I'm not sure, but I love that he did this. Because of how close his car had been to the curb where the bullet hit, he also made a detailed examination of the car to determine if any particles of the slug had lodged somewhere in the vehicle. Oh, that's right, because his car was right there behind where he was standing. He had just pulled to the side. He found no indication that this had happened, however. Remember, where it had hit, it said was actually like right where those walls were. So potentially it hit, deflected up to him, and a piece might have skittered off down through the underpass, perhaps. He awoke early the following day with a feeling of tense anticipation and hurried out to get the morning newspaper. But when he opened it, he was surprised and taken aback. I honestly expected to see my story splashed all over the place, but there was no mention of me at all. Not a word. And only a brief passing mention of how a bullet may have hit a curb. I was kind of disappointed. It wasn't that I wanted the publicity, but after telling several people what had happened and then not having any of it reported in the paper, I guess I felt a little foolish. I wondered if people would think I made the whole thing up. In the days that followed, Jim's chagrin gradually turned to irritation, then anger, then disbelief as he read news accounts about what official sources in Washington were saying about the number of shots fired and where they had struck. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a report to Bobby Kennedy just 72 hours after the assassination, saying there were only 3 shots, and all 3 of them had hit inside the presidential car, Tague said. After reading stuff like that, I finally got fed up and called the FBI. I said, look, I know one of the bullets missed the car. I know because a piece of it hit me. The very next day, 2 FBI agents came calling. At first, Tague was gratified for the chance to make his story part of the official record, albeit belatedly. But his interview with the federal agents was only a few minutes old when that feeling abruptly faded. The 2 FBI guys had sort of a ho-hum attitude about the whole thing. They didn't start to get interested until they just happened to ask if I knew Jack Ruby. I said, yeah, I guess everybody in town knows Jack or knows of him. And after that, we didn't talk about anything else. They spent maybe 4 or 5 minutes on the missing bullet and grilled me for an hour and a half about Ruby and what kind of association I had with him. Although Tague had met Ruby and had been to his clubs on occasion, his only real connection with the man who killed Lee Oswald was through Tague's roommate at the time, a professional guitar player named Jody Daniel, who had recently been dating a showgirl who worked for Ruby under the name Tammy True. Well, Tammy True has a relatively new documentary out on YouTube, and if you ever want to waste an afternoon, that's I won't even say entertaining. It is a time-passing way to spend an afternoon. Warning, you will see aging showgirls showing off their skills, and it's an interesting video. But it does go back and walk through her association with Jack Ruby, and there's nothing really about the case. I kind of had an afternoon where I was feeling kind of sick. I think maybe fighting a migraine or something, and I just needed something kind of quiet and interesting to play in the background while I just laid on my bed. And I I watched it, but if you need some way to pass the time, you could do that. But this Tammy True person did work for Ruby, and she has some interesting tales about who he was, the kind of man he was. That was the most relevant thing that comes out of her documentary, is just her personal interactions with Ruby. You can get a better sense of the man from how he interacted with her. They really worked the subject over, Jim says. They asked me everything they could possibly ask about Ruby and his employees. I told them they should talk to Jody and that I knew nothing. But they kept right on asking anyway. When the interview was finally over, I told myself I'd learned one important lesson. From now on, I'd keep my mouth shut. I was through with questioning official authority, and I hoped official authority was through questioning me. Still, because of the length and intensity of that FBI interview, Tague fully expected to be called to testify before the Warren Commission. But the months dragged on, and no subpoena arrived for him. In June 1964, when he read a newspaper article quoting Chief Counsel Lee J. Rankin as saying that the commission had completed its interviews and was winding up its investigation, Jim decided he would not be summoned as a witness at all. One morning, just a few days after reading that article, I made a chance remark to one of my customers at Cedar Springs Dodge about not being called by the Warren Commission. I was aware that this customer was an employee of the Dallas Times-Herald, but I knew that he didn't work in the news department, and it never occurred to me that he'd repeat what I said to a reporter, but that's exactly what happened. Only a few minutes after the customer's departure, Tague says, Times-Herald political writer Jim Lehrer showed up at the auto dealership with a pen poised and a notepad at the ready. Jim Tague could scarcely believe it. More than 7 months after the fact, a real live reporter was finally interested in breaking the story of the unknown third victim of the assassination. First I said no, Tague recalls, but then I said, okay, but only on one condition. I'll tell you the story if you promise not to use my name. Lehrer agreed, so I told him the whole thing. Unfortunately, a situation quickly developed in which Tague's identity could not be kept confidential. As Lehrer had promised, the story was published in the Times-Herald without his name, but no sooner had it appeared in print than it was eagerly picked up and pursued by the National Wire Services. The story hit the AP, and Lehrer called me and said he had to give the AP my name. From that point on, things started happening pretty fast. The first thing I knew, the Warren Commission announced it was reopening its investigation, and the FBI was being ordered to get that piece of curb. By this time, it was July 1964, and the mark on the curb had faded a lot. It was still visible, but the FBI couldn't even find it at first. When they did find it and test it, though, there were still detectable traces of lead and antimony on it, and there was no question a bullet had hit it. The next thing I knew, I was getting a subpoena. When Jim Tague gave his testimony to the Warren Commission on the afternoon of July 23rd, 1964, some 5 hours before Buddy Walthers gave his, some of the questions from his interviewer came as an eye-opening surprise. The questions gave Tague his first indication of something he was to learn for certain later on. That he had, for reasons that he still finds impossible to understand, been kept under surveillance by the FBI for months. The following is a portion of the official Warren Commission's transcript as it appears in Volume 7 of the Commission's report. Tague has just mentioned how he happened upon the scene the day of the assassination, got out of his car, saw the motorcade approaching, and almost immediately felt himself struck in the face by something. Liebler: Now I understand that you went back there subsequently and took some pictures of the area. Isn't that right? Pardon? I understand that you went back subsequently and took some pictures of the area. Yes, about a month ago. With a motion picture camera? Yes, I didn't know anybody knew about that. After a momentary bit of confusion over a photo mistakenly identified by Liebler as one taken by Tague, the line of questioning resumed. You yourself did take pictures of the area about a month ago? Yes, my wife and I were going to Indianapolis. This is the home of my parents. I was taking some pictures of the area to show to them. This was the latter part of May. Tague's consternation clearly shows through in his answers to Liebler's questions. How could Liebler possibly have known about Tague's return to the assassination site to take photographs unless someone had been following him the whole time? I had gone there alone and without announcing anything about it beforehand. When Liebler knew all about it, it was a dead giveaway that the FBI had been keeping a constant watch on me. That was the first tip-off, but there were others too. In all, as I learned later, I was followed by the FBI for about 8 months. When the FBI reports and memoranda pertaining to Tague were released to him years later under the FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, he also learned of the lengths to which federal agents had gone to make him appear to be an unreliable witness. One of their reports started off by referring to me as a used car salesman and sort of went downhill from there. It's funny now, we still have, I guess, that same idea, but there's plenty of people who deal in used cars. The used car market is much more needful now because of how inflation has gone. But especially back then, there was this picture of like a seedy used car salesman. Like, you can't trust them. They're snake oil salesmen. They're going to sell you a piece of junk and make you pay through the nose for it. It accused me of looking for notoriety and monetary gain, which is absolutely absurd. It should have been obvious to anyone that I wasn't after publicity, because the only time I had ever talked to a reporter, it was on the condition that my name wouldn't be used. Toward the end of the transcript of his interview, Tague's remarks become downright argumentative concerning the number of shots fired at the motorcade and where they struck. The following exchange illustrates Tague's irritation and Liebler's refusal to allow any discussion that would dispute the commission's forthcoming verdict of 3 bullets and 1 assassin. Do you remember seeing anything else or observing anything else that day that you think would be helpful to the commission or that I haven't asked you about? So that would seem to be like an open door, like anything you want to tell us, go ahead and tell us now. Tague: what struck me the most was that everybody said all 3 shots were accounted for. I felt very strongly that the 3rd shot hit down there on the curb, and there was the deputy sheriff and the patrolman down under the bridge right there with me. Now, you say you thought it was the 3rd shot that hit down there. No, I said I thought that all 3 shots were accounted for. All the newspaper accounts for months said all the shots were accounted for. In terms of hitting the car, yes. Well, there was a story in the paper more recently that indicated that one of them might have missed. Liebler seems to be referring to the story on Tague himself. That's right. Did you see that? That's right, yes. And then Tague says, the only thing that I saw that I thought was wrong was that there was about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes in there before anybody did anything about anything, talking about the Texas School Book Depository. Well, that was after the shots were fired? That was after the shots were fired. What do you mean before they did anything? There was no action taken except for the one policeman that I could see stopped his motorcycle and drew his gun, and he was the only one doing anything about it. You didn't see any other policemen around in the area? Not for 4 or 5 minutes. If Oswald was in that building, he had all the time in the world to calmly walk out of there. Apparently that is just what he did do. Well, if you can't think of anything else, Mr. Tague, I want to thank you for coming in and the cooperation you have given us. We appreciate it very much. Okay, he said. Well, it's interesting because his point was not, they tried to make it like, oh, he just walked right out of there. Well, Oswald was just standing in the cafeteria when the policeman and the building supervisor came up. So there was no walking out of there calmly trying to get away. That's not what happened at all. For the record, Tague does believe that it was the 3rd shot which struck the curb beside him, and he did hear only 3 shots, although he remains convinced that more than that were actually fired. Personally, I believe the 1st shot, the one that sounded like a firecracker, was a dud. I think that's the reason it sounded so weak and different from the others. I also believe that this was the so-called magic bullet that was later found on a stretcher at Parkland. I think it went into Kennedy's back and lodged there, then fell out at the hospital. Well, that would fit with what we just read in our last reading. Tague makes it clear that this is merely his own carefully considered opinion, based on his first-hand recollections and his study of the Zapruder film. But the indisputable fact remains that if 3 bullets struck within the presidential car and another struck the curb near Tague, all 4 of them could not have been fired by Oswald or by any other single individual for that matter. I don't see how there can be any question that more than one person was doing the shooting, he says. There is little doubt that the initial police response to the shooting in Dealey Plaza was indecisive and disorganized. But if it took officers on the scene between 5 and 10 minutes, and possibly somewhat longer, even to decide to secure and search the school book depository, how could the young, inexperienced Warren Commission lawyers so blithely assume that all the shots came from that location, or that they were all fired by the same person? Sloppy police work in frenetic moments is one thing. The repeated refusal to ask pertinent questions and develop crucial information during a months-long investigation of the same crime is quite another. All things considered, it is easy to understand why Jim Tague regards his nation's government with a degree of suspicion and distrust. If I hadn't had that chance encounter with someone who worked for the major newspaper, I'm convinced the stuff about the stray bullet would never have even shown up in the Warren Commission at all. And even then, they just let it drop. Tague still holds to a slim hope that the mystery can one day be solved. I think the truth, if we could find it, would be basically simple, he says. Then he adds thoughtfully, finding it might have been pretty simple too if we had really tried back in 1964. But now, the forgotten third victim of the assassination shrugs and touches his once wounded cheek where not even a hint of a scar remains. What a reading. I really enjoyed that. It got us right into the scene. You can imagine the activity of just driving up and just stopping and happening to be there for all of that and to become the reason why the Warren Commission had to change its whole approach to the 3 bullets found on the 6th floor. Very fascinating. Not only that, but he's right there on that little median and he's seeing things unfold out in front of him. The crowds, people's observations about Kennedy's head, and then his observations about both the FBI. He got to see Oswald come in. You guys, what an account by Jim Tague. And thank you to Bill Sloan for delivering it to us. You guys, this book is called JFK Breaking the Silence. You might remember we read a little bit of this from the Ed Hoffman chapter, but there are many chapters in here with key witnesses just like this. So I just want to point you to this book. It's called 12 First-Hand Accounts Reveal the Untold Story Behind the Assassination. So you can do your own digging through books like this. I love Bill Sloan's storytelling pace and style. He gives us a good amount of detail and research and actual interviews and actual quotes, and also interlaces it with helpful narrative. So I hope you really enjoyed it. I hope you have a great day. Let me know in the comments what you noticed, and next time we will be going through these portions of these books to discover about the grassy knoll, some observations and firsthand witnesses there. So come back for that. We'll see you soon. Have a great day. Bye.